In Kent, southeast England, there is a small stretch of marshland that sits in the River Medway, close to the Isle of Sheppy. This muddy island is strictly off limits to visitors due to the important role it plays in maintaining a healthy bird population in the area. It is a crucial breeding and nesting ground and is owned by Natural England. At a glance, the island seems completely unassuming, boring even. Nothing but mud banks and weeds. But the island's name reveals that there is more to these mudflats than it first appears. This is Deadman's Island, and it is covered in human bones. Now, when I say covered, I don't mean one or two skeletons. It is thought that there could be upwards of 200 individuals buried on the island. While some of these bones are still contained within the borders of their badly rotten caskets, many others are simply scattered throughout the island, poking out of the mud or tangled up with the grass and sticks. So, why is this island covered in unmarked graves? Who were these people? And how did they end up buried on an uninhabited strip of marshland? To get the answer to these questions, we need to go back in time. All the way back to the Napoleonic Wars, so a little over 200 years ago. As war raged between the British and the French, casualties were inevitable. However, the bones on the island were not there as a result of combat. In fact, the bones were more likely to belong to those who survived a battle. Britain had been involved in several wars during the previous decades, and with each conflict came more prisoners. Problem was, prisons all over the country were already massively overcrowded and were unable to accommodate the massive influx of convicts. To give you an idea of why they were so overcrowded, back then a 12-year-old boy could be caught stealing a chicken and sentenced to death. This harsh punishment was thanks to the later named Bloody Code, which listed over 200 crimes for which the punishment was death. But thankfully, the judges of the time could see that many of the crimes did not fit the punishment, and most death sentences were reduced, with the prisoner being sentenced to transportation instead. But with so many crimes carrying this extreme sentence, and with judges unwilling to enforce it, it didn't take long for the prisons to fill up with those awaiting transport. Eventually, the prisons just couldn't hold any more inmates, and with more and more prisoners of war being captured on top of this, Britain was forced to find a solution to the overcrowding issue. As a temporary measure, it was decided that ships, gutted of their inner workings, would be used to house inmates until they could be transported. These prison ships, or prison hulks, came into use in 1776, and only became more popular as time went on. The ships would be moored and then stripped of any unnecessary fittings to make space for the cells to hold the inmates. While the hulks were intended to be temporary in nature, they remained in use for many years, and the huge backlog of prisoners meant that some would end up serving their entire sentence aboard, while others would be pardoned once transport became available due to only having a year or two left to serve. Those who were transported would be taken to one of the colonies, most notably Australia. Once there, the prisoners would serve their time doing hard labour. For those stuck aboard the hulks long term, life was not any easier. Conditions were reportedly horrific. Men, boys, and even sometimes women were all crammed together, regardless of the severity of their crime. This meant that a hardened criminal and a young boy that had stolen some food could wind up serving their sentences together, which I'm sure was absolutely terrifying. With the ever-increasing number of prisoners, those in charge sought to cram as many inmates aboard the ships as possible, and, predictably, this led to the same overcrowding problem that they had on land. The overcrowding, intense heat, and lack of proper ventilation unsurprisingly led to outbreaks of disease. These diseases could be brought aboard directly by prisoners or caused by contaminated water supplies. The grim conditions drove some mad, and others sought to injure themselves for the chance to be transferred to a hospital ship. Fights broke out between prisoners often, and sometimes the guard wouldn't intervene, especially if the victim was a prisoner of war. But What does all of this have to do with our skeleton-covered island? Well, let's say, for example, there was a contaminated water supply being used as drinking water for the inmates. This causes a cholera outbreak, which, combined with disinterested guards, leads to many deaths. It is reported that sometimes, due to the dark, dingy conditions below deck, it could take a few days for the guards to even notice a body. I'm sure you can imagine that living in close proximity to a rotting corpse was not good for the mental or physical health of the remaining prisoners. And, of course, this led to even more deaths. The prevailing theory of the time was that disease was contracted by breathing in bad air, or miasma. Miasma could be detected by its foul smell, and it was thought to move like smoke through the air, infecting people as it went. This stance meant that disease could sweep through crowded areas uninhibited, as it wasn't thought that people could directly infect one another. In the case of an overcrowded prison hulk, this was deadly. It is reported that 1 in 4 of those imprisoned aboard the hulks would perish. So, with the bodies piling up, those in charge had a growing issue. And the nearby uninhabited island seemed like the ideal solution to that problem. It was to become a graveyard for the deceased inmates. The prisoners, although at least buried in simple wooden coffins, were not given headstones. Children would be buried alongside the adults. It is thought that some of the bones on the island could have belonged to civilians too, as, at the time, entry into the country required a 40-day quarantine period, to reduce the risk of disease being brought in from elsewhere. If somebody passed away in that time, and they were in a nearby quarantine zone, they could find themselves buried alongside the inmates. Eventually, prison hulks were mostly phased out, although they are occasionally still used to ease overcrowding issues. Many of the old ships were destroyed, leaving little to no trace that they had ever been there. But the bones of those buried in the unmarked graves would remain for many years. Until, due to erosion around the mudflat, they began to resurface. The wooden coffins, destroyed by time and exposure, freeing the bones inside. Ultimately, the island is a remnant of the past. Of a time when we didn't have the tools or the knowledge to understand, treat, and prevent disease. A time when stealing a loaf of bread could land you aboard a deadly prison hulk. Efforts were made to separate young offenders from adults, and several youth-only hulks were in use for some years. As we became more knowledgeable about the spread of disease, procedures were put in place to reduce transmissions. There have been questions raised about what to do with the bones now that they have risen to the surface. Should they be reburied, or moved to a different site? The consensus is that, since they have been revealed due to a natural process, they should be left alone. And, as nobody is allowed to visit Deadman's Island, nature will be left to run its course. The tide will continue eroding more of the island, pulling the bones out of the mud, and, eventually, there may not be any bones left, all swept out into the water, where they will sway with the waves, forever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If you have a story or event you would like me to cover, please leave your suggestions in the comments below. Thanks again, and keep yourself safe out there.